The Holloway estate sat where the sun refused to linger. The road to it was little more than a serpent's trail of mud and stone, winding through trees that grew too close together, trees that seemed to listen. When Claire Weston first saw the place, she thought it resembled an open wound in the landscape, raw and festering, the house sagging as though its bones had grown tired of holding secrets. The locals had warned her not to go. They said the Holloways were cursed, that their blood had turned against them generations ago. But Claire was not one for ghost stories. She came for truth, the kind buried beneath layers of superstition and fear. Claire Weston had always been drawn to the places that no one wanted to remember. As an investigative journalist, she had built her reputation uncovering the buried rot beneath America's forgotten towns, the kind of places that existed only as whispers in county records and half-told stories by trembling old men at bars. So, when she heard about the Holloway estate, a decaying mansion deep in the heart of Appalachia, she felt that familiar pull, that gnawing curiosity that kept her awake at night. According to local legend, the Holloways were an old family, one of the first to settle in those dense, shadow-drenched woods. Over 7 generations, they had lived and died there, cut off from the rest of the world. But the real intrigue lay in what people refused to say aloud. The villagers claimed that their children, born after centuries of inbreeding, had lost the ability to speak entirely. Some said they were born without tongues. Others whispered that they were born with no need for them. Claire wasn't one to believe in curses. She believed in cause and effect, in trauma passed through bloodlines, in history buried under silence. So, she packed her recorder, camera, and a single suitcase, taking the bus as far as it would go before the road turned to dirt and the trees began to close in. The driver had warned her, glancing back in the mirror with eyes that didn't meet hers. "You don't go poking around the Holloway woods, miss. They don't take kindly to visitors." She laughed it off, but there was something in his tone that stayed with her. When she finally reached the small mountain town nearest to the estate, she could feel the unease before anyone spoke a word. The locals avoided her questions, offering only evasive phrases and sidelong glances. An old woman selling apples muttered that the Holloway blood don't run clean and refused to take Claire's money. Every mention of the family was met with a subtle shift in the air, a quieting of conversations, as though saying their name out loud might summon something unwanted. Still, Claire pressed on. To her, this wasn't horror, it was history. A story of isolation, madness, and decay, the kind that revealed the darker corners of humanity. She imagined herself uncovering records, finding evidence, perhaps even meeting a surviving Holloway if one still lived. What she didn't realize was that the story waiting for her wasn't one of discovery, but of inheritance. The Holloway estate didn't just hold its silence. It was built from it, brick by brick, generation by generation, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. The deeper Claire ventured into the Appalachian backroads, the more she understood why the Holloways had been forgotten. The woods grew thicker, darker, and quieter with every mile, until the sound of her rental car seemed like an intrusion on something ancient and undisturbed. When she finally arrived at the outskirts of the Holloway property, she found a rusted gate half buried in vines, its iron frame engraved with a name nearly worn away by time. Beyond it lay a narrow path swallowed by overgrown weeds and crooked trees, leading to the mansion that the locals swore was still occupied, though no one had seen a Holloway in decades. The silence there was not empty. It was deliberate, as if the land itself had learned to hold its breath. Claire walked the path cautiously, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Every now and then, she thought she heard faint movement in the woods, a branch snapping, a breath just out of sight. But when she turned, there was only the trembling of leaves. The estate appeared slowly, rising out of the fog like a ghost summoned from memory. It was enormous but crumbling, its wooden panels warped by time and rain. Windows were either shattered or boarded up from the inside, and ivy crawled up the walls like veins feeding on decay. It looked less like a home and more like a living organism, rotting but unwilling to die. For nearly a century, the Holloways had lived without contact from the outside world. Old records mentioned their name less and less as the years passed, until it disappeared entirely from public record. Neighbors said they refused visitors. Deliveries were left at the gate, always gone the next morning, payment waiting in the same place. Old coins or faded bills decades out of circulation. It was as if time had stopped at the edge of their land. When the last census takers came through in the early 1900s, they noted strange behavior among the Holloway children. They never spoke, never cried, and seemed unable to respond to spoken language. Soon after, no one from the government dared to return. Claire felt both fear and fascination. What kind of family could exist this way, locked in silence for generations? She imagined their nights, candlelight flickering on pale faces, the only sounds the creak of floorboards and the hiss of the wind through broken glass. The house stood as a monument to their isolation, a place untouched by modern life, where whispers became myths and myths became warnings. And as Claire crossed the threshold, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Holloways weren't merely silent by nature, but by necessity. Claire spent her first evening in the nearby town of Barlow Ridge, gathering scraps of information from the locals who were willing to talk. Most weren't. The Holloway names seemed to carry an invisible weight that pressed down on conversations until they suffocated. When she mentioned the rumors about children born without tongues, the bartender simply crossed himself and muttered that some things were better left buried. An old hunter at the end of the bar told her that the Holloways hadn't spoken to anyone outside their property since before his grandfather's time. They keep to themselves, he said, his eyes fixed on his drink. And we keep to ours. That's how it's always been. To Claire, these cryptic warnings sounded like small-town superstition, the kind of folklore that grew in places where isolation and ignorance mixed for too long. She had seen it before, rumors that twisted the truth into something monstrous. She convinced herself that the idea of children born without tongues was nothing more than a metaphor, a way for frightened people to explain mental illness, genetic defects, or even social withdrawal. Inbreeding often led to physical and cognitive abnormalities. Perhaps the Holloway children had been mute or developmentally delayed, and the story had taken on a darker shape over generations of retelling. To Claire, it was a symbol, not of horror, but of what happens when humanity turns inward too far, when bloodlines become cages. The journalist in her wanted to expose the truth beneath the myth, to strip away the fear and reveal the fragile human story that must have started it all. Still, something about the way the townspeople avoided her gaze unsettled her. Even those who claimed not to believe in curses lowered their voices when they spoke the family's name. One man, a retired mail carrier, told her he used to deliver letters to the Holloway gate when he was young. They'd leave notes for me, he said, but not written like ours. Just symbols, circles, lines, and crosses, sometimes smudged with what looked like blood. When Claire pressed him for details, he went pale and refused to say more. That night, in her small motel room, Claire couldn't sleep. The wind outside moaned against the thin windows, carrying with it the distant creak of trees and the faint sound of something that almost resembled a voice. She told herself it was nothing, just the woods playing tricks on her mind. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, she imagined those voiceless children, their mouths open but silent, trying to say something that no one had ever been able to hear. When Claire finally reached the Holloway mansion, it stood before her like a monument to decay and secrecy. The structure seemed alive in its disrepair, a living corpse, breathing faintly through the cracks of its boarded windows and the gaps in its swollen doors. The path leading up to it was choked with weeds, and a rusted swing hung from a dying oak tree, swaying without wind. She hesitated at the porch, feeling the temperature drop as though the air itself recoiled from the place. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, and the smell that met her was a mix of mildew, iron, and something faintly sweet, like fruit left too long to rot. Dust hung thick in the air, glittering faintly in the sunlight that forced its way through the cracks. The house didn't feel abandoned, it felt waiting. Claire moved slowly through the main hall, her flashlight cutting through years of darkness. The walls were covered in warped wallpaper, curling away like old skin. But beneath it, she began to see markings, crude carvings etched into the wooden panels, hidden beneath layers of decay. At first, they seemed random, lines, shapes, small notches in the wood. But as she followed them deeper into the house, their meaning grew clearer. They were drawings, rough and childlike, scratched by hands that trembled or lacked control. She saw figures of women lying on beds, surrounded by smaller shapes that looked like children. She saw blood dripping from lines that resembled mouths, though some of those mouths were sealed shut. One drawing depicted a circle of people holding hands, their heads bowed beneath a symbol she didn't recognize, something between a tree and a spine. She photographed everything, her hands shaking slightly as she zoomed in on the carvings. The further she went, the more disturbing the imagery became. In one room, she found a wall completely covered in overlapping etchings, faces without eyes, infants in cribs, a house surrounded by claw-like branches. And always, somewhere near the center, a pattern of lines that looked like roots stretching downward into the floor. It was as if generations had tried to tell their story in silence, carving their agony into the bones of the house itself. In the dining room, the table was still set for 6, the plates fused with dust and cobwebs. A single candle had melted into a hardened pool of wax, its wick long dead. The atmosphere pressed around her chest as she took another step forward. From somewhere deeper within the house, she thought she heard a faint scrape, like wood shifting under weight, or perhaps fingernails dragging across the wall. As Claire continued exploring the Holloway mansion, she began to sense that the house itself was trying to communicate, though not through words. The silence was heavy, textured, it had a pulse. Every step she took made the floor groan beneath her, and each echo seemed to linger too long, as if the house didn't want to let go of the sound. The deeper she went, the more she noticed peculiar inconsistencies. Certain doors were nailed shut from the inside, while others had locks thick with rust, far too large for any ordinary purpose. She followed a narrow hallway lined with portraits, their faces smeared with age, the eyes scratched out as though someone had tried to erase them. At the end of that hall, she found a small wooden door half hidden behind a collapsed cabinet. Unlike the others, this one was reinforced with iron straps, and a chain hung loosely across its frame. She knelt to inspect it, tracing her fingers over the grain. It felt cold to the touch, colder than the rest of the wood around it, as if something behind it drained the warmth from the air. Then she heard it, a faint tapping. At first, she thought it might be the settling of the house or a loose pipe knocking behind the walls, but this sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It came in intervals, 3 short taps, then silence, then 2 longer ones. She froze, her heart thudding in response. She called out softly, her voice breaking the suffocating quiet, but no answer came. Only the sound of her own breathing and the steady pulse of that tapping, as if whatever was beneath the floor was listening. Claire backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She scanned the floorboards and noticed that in this section of the house, the wood looked newer, as if it had been replaced recently compared to the rest of the decaying structure. There were faint stains between the seams, dark, reddish-brown smears that had long dried. She crouched down and pressed her ear against the floor. The sound came again, clearer this time, echoing faintly from below. Something, or someone, was moving down there. She tried to convince herself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon trapped in the crawl space, but the rhythm of those taps carried intention. It felt like a message, a code. She remembered the hunter's words in the bar about children born without tongues, and felt a chill crawl up her spine. What if the silence wasn't just their curse? What if it was their prison? What if, beneath her feet, generations of Holloways still waited, trapped in darkness, tapping out a language no one had ever understood? As dusk settled over the Holloway estate, the air thickened into something almost physical, a quiet that pressed against Claire's skin like damp cloth. Her flashlight beam had started to fade, the batteries dying, so she relied on the last rays of orange light spilling through the fractured windows. That was when she saw movement at the end of the hallway, a frail silhouette, small and bent, gliding rather than walking. Her instinct screamed to run, but her curiosity anchored her in place. The figure stopped beneath a doorway, half-lit, its hand gripping the frame for balance. Claire called out softly, her voice echoing into the empty rooms. There was no reply, only a low, guttural sound. Not a word, not even a groan, but something in between, like breath trying to form language. The woman was ancient, her back hunched and her face folded by years of solitude. Her hair was white as cobwebs, hanging in thin strands around her hollow cheeks. She wore a tattered nightdress that seemed to blend with the dust. When Claire approached, The woman flinched but did not flee. Her eyes, clouded but aware, flicked toward the floor, then back to Claire. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but what came out was a deep hum, almost melodic but painfully strained. Claire felt an unexpected wave of pity. This had to be one of the last Holloways, the matriarch people spoke of in whispers. The woman gestured shakily, her bony fingers trembling as she pointed toward the ground, toward the place where Claire had heard the tapping earlier. Then she pressed a hand against her throat and shook her head slowly, her lips trembling as she released another broken hum. The message was unmistakable. She could not speak. Claire tried to ask questions, to make sense of what the old woman was showing her, but the only response was more gestures, more frantic pointing at the floorboards. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she began to hit her own chest softly, as if begging Claire to understand. Claire looked where she pointed, to the base of the staircase, where a trapdoor seemed to blend seamlessly into the wood. She hadn't noticed it before. The hinges were rusted but intact, sealed with an iron clasp. The old woman stumbled toward it, her bare feet dragging on the floor, and placed her trembling hand on the lock. Then she turned to Claire with a pleading look, the kind that bypassed words entirely. Whatever was beneath that trapdoor, whatever had been hidden by generations of silence, was something she wanted Claire to see, or perhaps something she needed her to free. That night, the storm rolled in without warning. Rain hammered against the Holloway mansion's roof like fists, and the wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls. Claire had set up her recorder and flashlight near the staircase where she'd found the trapdoor, determined to return to it in the morning when the weather cleared. But as midnight came and the power of the storm grew, the house began to feel smaller, more suffocating. Every creak and groan of the old wood carried weight, as if the structure itself were restless. She tried to sleep in one of the upstairs rooms, a child's room, judging by the broken toys scattered across the floor and the faded wallpaper covered in hand-drawn shapes. Lightning flashed through the boards, illuminating those crude drawings for a moment, and in that instant, she thought she saw new ones that hadn't been there before, small hands pressed into the dust, the prints fresh and sharp. Claire's eyes snapped open at a sound, faint, irregular, just beneath her. It was the same tapping she'd heard earlier, only now it was accompanied by something else, a soft, dragging noise, like fingers scratching wood. The sound seemed to move directly under her bed, pacing slowly back and forth. She leaned over, pressed her ear to the floor, and froze. There was crying, faint, muffled, the unmistakable sound of a child's sob, trapped beneath the floorboards. Her body went cold. She whispered a shaky hello, but the crying stopped instantly, replaced by silence so deep it rang in her ears. For several minutes she sat there, heart pounding, before reaching for her flashlight. She aimed it at the wooden planks and noticed that one corner of the room had been patched unevenly. The nails were newer than the rest, and the boards were slightly raised. She forced her trembling fingers to pry at one of them. The wood lifted with a long, painful groan, and a burst of damp, sour air rushed out from below. What she saw made her drop the light. There were bones, small, brittle, arranged in strange patterns. Skeletal hands clutched wooden dolls, crudely carved and missing their mouths. Some of the bones had been wrapped in faded cloth, like a burial shroud for something that had never been allowed to rest. The air beneath the floor pulsed with a presence she could feel more than see. Her flashlight rolled away and landed at an angle, its beam falling on something written on the inside of the boards, jagged letters carved by desperate hands. The words were simple, uneven, but clear enough to read. They said, "We tried to speak." The discovery beneath the floorboards left Claire shaken, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely hold her recorder steady. The storm outside had calmed, but inside the Holloway mansion, the air felt heavier than ever, thick with secrets pressing to be heard. She sat on the floor beside the open boards, staring into the shallow pit of bones and relics. The dolls with missing mouths haunted her, their wooden faces expressionless yet accusing. She began searching frantically through the nearby rooms for something, anything, that could explain what she had found. In one of the upper corridors, hidden behind a fallen wardrobe, she discovered a narrow door leading to a small library coated in dust. Most of the shelves were empty, the few remaining books swollen with moisture and age, but among them lay several leather-bound journals tied with string and sealed in wax so old it crumbled at her touch. The handwriting inside was erratic, uneven, as though written by trembling hands. The earliest entries were mundane, farm records, weather notes, family births. But as she turned the pages, the tone began to shift. Mentions of the sickness of the bloodline appeared repeatedly, along with desperate prayers for purity and forgiveness. Then came the accounts of the children, those born whole yet broken, unable to form words, their tongues fused from birth. The writer, who identified himself as Thomas Holloway, recorded his belief that this was punishment, not by God but by the land itself. "We took root where the earth did not want us," he wrote, "and now it takes its due." Claire felt her stomach twist as she read further. The entries described how each generation had married within the family to preserve what they called the sacred line, believing their silence to be a mark of divine favor rather than deformity. The journals spoke of rituals, births performed in secret beneath the house, the mothers forbidden to scream, the infants baptized not with water but with soil from the woods outside. Thomas wrote that the silence of the Holloway children was necessary, that their muteness kept the forest spirit at peace. He claimed that when a child tried to cry, strange winds tore through the trees, and the family took it as a warning. Claire realized the carvings she'd seen on the walls weren't random. They were records, perhaps even prayers. Every drawing of sealed mouths and bleeding roots was a chapter in a story the family could no longer tell aloud. Closing the journal, she looked back toward the hallway, her pulse quickening. The tapping sound had returned, fainter this time, but it was there, as if something beneath the floor still wanted her to keep reading. The longer Claire read, the more the Holloway's madness unfolded like a dark inheritance passed from one trembling hand to another. The later entries in the journals were nearly illegible, the words smeared and scrawled with desperation. They spoke of rituals performed to feed the silence, ceremonies that grew stranger and more grotesque with each generation. The family had come to believe that their condition, the loss of speech, the fused tongues, the voiceless births, was not a curse to be cured but a sacred offering. According to the writings, the Holloways believed a spirit lived within the woods that surrounded their estate, an ancient presence bound to their blood. The silence, they wrote, was the only thing that kept it asleep. If the tongue is loosed, one line read, the forest wakes, and the roots remember the blood they were denied. Claire turned page after page, each entry painting a clearer picture of a family that had sealed its own fate. The rituals were always performed in the basement, the same space beneath the floor where she'd heard tapping, the same darkness that had swallowed generations whole. Women gave birth there, surrounded by symbols carved into the walls, while the rest of the family hummed in unison, their low, guttural sounds echoing like a twisted lullaby. They believed the vibrations of their humming pleased the spirit, that it would keep their offspring safe from its wrath. Some entries described how any child born with the ability to cry or speak was returned to the roots, a phrase Claire refused to interpret at first but soon understood with sickening clarity. The final entries were more fragmented, written in a trembling hand that barely clung to sanity. They spoke of voices coming from the earth, of whispers bleeding through the floorboards, of the dead trying to speak again. One passage in particular stopped Claire cold. The silence is thinning. We buried too deep. The spirit is restless, and the children beneath the house move in their sleep. The page ended with a blot of ink, as if the writer had dropped the pen mid-sentence. As the last candle in the room flickered low, Claire could feel that the air had changed again. The stillness wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. The sound she had mistaken for the storm returned, softer now, like breath exhaled through the floorboards. The realization settled in her mind like ice. The Holloways hadn't been keeping the world away to protect themselves. They had been keeping something inside, something that had learned to live in the dark, nourished by silence, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. Claire's instincts told her to run, to leave the Holloway mansion and never look back, but the weight of what she had uncovered rooted her to the spot. The air inside the house had turned thick and electric, the walls seeming to breathe with her every movement. She gathered her recorder, her flashlight, and the journals, her hands shaking so badly she could barely keep her grip. Every step toward the door felt heavier, as if the air itself was trying to hold her back. The moment she crossed into the main hallway, the tapping beneath the floor began again. Faster this time, urgent, almost angry. It wasn't a random rhythm anymore. It was a pattern, deliberate and growing louder. She realized it was coming from all directions now, from every inch of the floor around her. Then came another sound. The faint creak of floorboards near the staircase, the unmistakable pressure of footsteps that weren't hers. Claire turned the flashlight toward the stairs. The beam flickered once before catching movement, small, pale shapes emerging from the shadows. At first she thought they were mannequins, the kind she had seen in old department stores, their limbs thin and stiff. But then they moved again, and she saw their faces. Children, dozens of them, their eyes wide and glassy, their mouths sealed shut by pale skin stretched smooth where lips should have been. Their silence was absolute, so complete it seemed to swallow every sound in the room. They didn't walk, they glided, their bare feet making no noise on the wooden floor. She stumbled backward, the flashlight trembling in her grip, its beam darting over the walls. Everywhere she looked, she saw them, crouching in doorways, standing behind furniture, half hidden in the shadows, all watching her with the same unblinking gaze. Some were older, their features sharper, their skin cracked with age, yet their silence was the same. They moved closer, their heads tilting in unison, and for a moment Claire thought she could hear something beneath their stillness, a faint hum, deep and rhythmic, like the sound the old woman had made. Panicked, Claire turned toward the front door, but the wind outside had risen into a howl, bending the trees as if the forest itself was alive. The children began to hum louder, their throats vibrating though no sound escaped their mouths. The vibrations made the floor tremble beneath her feet, the boards creaking like the house was exhaling after years of holding its breath. As she reached for the door, she felt the first small hand grasp her ankle, cold, fragile, and unrelenting. When she looked down, dozens more hands were reaching out from beneath the floorboards, pulling themselves upward in eerie silence, their hollow eyes fixed on her as if welcoming her home.